What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be talking about Underworld Evolution. So I'm once again joined by my buddy Dave from Interpreting the Stars to talk about the Underworld films. So far we've covered the prequel Rise of the Lycans, which Dave was not a fan of, and then we covered the original Underworld, which is a film that I enjoy a lot and Dave actually was a little bit more on board with. But now here we are talking about the original sequel to this series, and yeah, we're going to be hearing from Dave in just a little bit, but a big thanks to him for being in this video as usual, and you guys can find the link to his channel down below in the description box. Go give him some love, let him know I sent you. But for now, let's get into my thoughts on Underworld Evolution. So when you go online, on Rotten Tomatoes, this movie has, I believe, a 17% with critics and something around 74, if I'm not mistaken, with audiences, which is just insane. The fact that the score is so abysmally low is pretty ridiculous, to be completely and utterly honest. I don't think this movie deserves that at all. I think there's definitely things to praise about this movie. However, the movie does have some narrative issues and some structure issues that ultimately I feel will not allow everyone to connect with this movie. Now, I think it's really important to know, at least from my perspective, that as a kid, I was obsessed with action movies of all kinds, even if they had terrible narratives. So, you know, I think we all have those movies in our line of films that we've watched in our life that aren't all that great, but we enjoy them because maybe they have some sort of nostalgic attachment to them, or we have a nostalgic attachment to them, or it's just a movie that, you know, maybe is like a guilty pleasure. And so in a lot of ways, this series does have a guilty pleasure element for me. I do really enjoy Rise of the Lycans, despite criticisms that I do have about it, and I really enjoy Underworld. I enjoy the lore, I enjoy the look, feel, and vibe of these movies, and I've always just enjoyed this late 90s, early 2000s, very interesting vampire craze that we had a lot of movies of in this era. This film is once again directed by Wiseman, and I think for the most part, specifically in the action sequences, the direction here is pretty solid. I really enjoy the way that the film looks. Again, I enjoy that very interesting blue grayish tint that's over these films. I really enjoy the costume design, the set design, the look, the feel, the vibe of the film for the most part. The practical effects, which are something I didn't really touch on as much in my last review for Underworld, which I should have. Dave covered that for me though, thankfully. But yeah, without a doubt, the practical effects of this series for the most part are usually really solid, and I really like the costume design and just the commitment to this world overall, especially in a lot of the sets that they built for this world. And yeah, this film, like a lot of the other films in this series, definitely struggles when it comes to a lot of the CGI. There's definitely moments, especially with the werewolves, where it just gets a little bit messy looking and it doesn't really look all that great. It looks a little cartoony and it kind of takes you out of it, because then you'll have a practical werewolf on screen, or, you know, a practical vampire on screen that looks really, really good. And so the best practical effect in this film, without a doubt, comes from the character of Marcus. Now, I mentioned before, I was kind of lost track of what I was saying a second ago, but you know, I mentioned how I think it's important that I note that these films have a guilty pleasure nostalgic attachment for me, because I've seen these movies many, many times. So I've been able to kind of soak up the lines of dialogue and the names of various characters and the lore a little bit more. Now, that doesn't necessarily say that this film is phenomenal, because there is definitely an element about this film that feels very hollow. It feels like they have a really good concept, but the script definitely needed a once-over to make it really, really solid. However, I'm a little bit more attached to what's going on, the characters and all this stuff and the lore, so I feel like I was able to enjoy it a lot more on rewatch this time around. But it was interesting to hear Dave's thoughts, because I was actually watching the films for the very first time with my fiance, who's never seen these movies, and she shared a fairly similar feel and vibe to what Dave is going to say in just a little bit. So yeah, you know, it was interesting to hear various opinions from those who are maybe experiencing these for the very first time. The basic premise of this movie is that in the last movie, we kept hearing about this vampire elder named Marcus. The movie opens up and we learn more about Marcus and his father Alex and his brother William, and just essentially the start of the vampires and the Lycans. So this movie just starts off with a lot of exposition explaining how the vampires and the Lycans were all kind of coming to be, how the immortals of various kinds came to be, and yeah, this is really what the film focuses on once we have Marcus returning, who is the original vampire. Now, up to this point, it's believed that the character of Victor was the original vampire, played by Bill Nighy, who dies in the first film and is a big part of the prequel. Well, it turns out that Marcus was actually the original vampire who actually got Victor involved with the vampire world. They were both elders, and Marcus has kind of had this vendetta against Victor and the other vampires for quite some time because his brother William was the first ever Lycan, the first ever werewolf, except he's just become a full-blown monster. The vampires entrapped him for many years, and now that Marcus is back, he wants to get his brother out, and he doesn't really give a damn about the other vampires. He doesn't give a damn about the war between the vampires and the werewolves, and ultimately that's his agenda the entire time, is to get his brother out of this imprisonment that he's been a part of this entire time. So then, playing off of the end of the last movie, you have Scott Speedman's character, who is a hybrid between vampires and Lycans, and is the first of the kind, and you know, it's something that they don't want to have at all. And so you have Kate Beckinsale's character Selene and Scott Speedman's character out on this adventure together as they run away from the various vampires and threats that they have to deal with, specifically Marcus, who's now on the hunt for Kate Beckinsale and Scott Speedman. And that's pretty much the movie. And if that sounded a little bit messy, I will say I think the movie definitely kind of presents it in that way. My fiance was like, yeah, I'm following what's happening, but it's just a little bit messy, and I really don't remember any of these characters' names or really what's going on. And I honestly can't blame her or anybody else that feels that way about this movie. It is a bit messy in the way it chooses to tell its story. I do really thoroughly enjoy it still. I enjoy the lore and this world, and I think that the concept of the film is way better than the execution. Now, I definitely have more to say about this movie without a doubt, but before we get to that, let's hear what Dave from Interpreting the Stars had to say about this.
It's Dave from Interpreting the Stars, back on Anthony's channel to discuss another film in the series that I never really understood why movies just kept on popping out with. Was it really ever that popular? I don't know. Underworld Evolution is ultimately about Selene and Michael on the run as the rebirth of Marcus, another vampire elder, makes headlines as Batman! Honestly, coming up with a plot synopsis for this movie was kind of hard for me to do because I was having a very hard time following anything. My wife, who is more or less a fan of the series, had told me, even though she didn't remember that much about this movie, she told me her 30-second review, which is as follows. Honestly, this movie is just Selene and Scott Speedman's character running around the whole movie as a guy flies around like a doofus. Honestly, that's about what I took out of it as well. Look, there's certain things that I liked about this movie. I mean, the first shot of it with Marcus's piercing eye, that was pretty neat, and I also think his overall design was pretty awesome. But the story is honestly kind of all over the place when it never really needed to be. That's because of the added storyline of Alexander Corvinus, and honestly, anything regarding the werewolves. This film would have done so much better if they just focused on vampires, because I was so confused that I took to Wikipedia to try to gain some clarity over everything, but even Wikipedia didn't make sense to me. What about the action? I would say some of the action was cool, especially with Marcus's character, but overall not as good as the action scene in the first movie, and I also thought that Scott Speedman's character felt remarkably unimportant this time around. He was the center of everything in the first movie, and without him, that story couldn't even be told at all. But in the sequel, he just kind of seemed to be a tag-along character that offers his ability to be the muscle here and there to battle the bad guys, but I didn't care about his arc or whatever, since there didn't really seem to be any this time around. The only thing that I thought was important that happened in this story specifically was something that happened to Selene, which I don't know if you're talking spoilers, Anthony, so I won't talk about it, but I thought it was interesting enough and opens doors for possible events in the future, but this movie specifically was boring and confusing to me, and I had a heck of a time trying to fairly score it, but let's try anyway. From a strictly technical or unbiased perspective, the only thing that stood out to me here was probably the visuals, which sometimes looked crisp and really nice. At other times, especially with the werewolves, it looked like dumpster fire. So my visual score only received half points. I will give credit where it's due for the basic structure of the film, which, even though I found it to be convoluted, it still followed a structure that made somewhat sense. Threat shows up, obstacle, obstacle, obstacle to beat it, climax, calming down moment with a sense of new norm, and it had all of that. So good job in general, but I guess everything else was neither here nor there for me. This scores 56%. As for how I personally felt about the film, or my bias score, I didn't really care for the movie at all. I was only really ever engaged with certain action scenes and some of the stuff with Marcus, but I had a heck of a time following the story or caring about the characters as a whole. There is very little depth or meat to the story that audiences can connect with, at least in my opinion, so this score is 52%. When we combine the two scores together, we come to the final rating of 54%, 54 out of 100 possible stars, which for me, not a failing grade, but it's pretty darn close. Thank you, Anthony, for inviting me to your channel once again to talk about Underworld. I don't know where it goes from here, no idea, but I have the distinct impression that it gets worse. I hope I'm wrong, but, only time can tell. I will leave you with that, and I will send it back your way to finish out your thoughts on Underworld Evolution. Peace out!
A big thanks to Dave for being here in this video. We have 2 more Underworld films after this, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts on them. And to be completely honest, the next one, Awakening, I saw it in theaters, and it was the last time I saw that movie and the last Underworld movie that I ever saw. So the last one that we will be covering, Blood Wars, I believe is what it's called, is going to be the first time watch for both Dave and I, and Dave, being a newcomer to the series and me being somebody who's kind of seasoned with this series. So I'm looking forward to that one. But a big thanks to Dave for being here in this video. I think I definitely enjoy this film a lot more than you, for sure. But yeah, your rating in the 50s is not necessarily a shocker to me. I can't say I would put it too much higher. I would say I'd put this movie somewhere in the 60s for me, 6.5, maybe 6.8 at most. I think where this movie really shines for me, really without a doubt, is in its action and in its effects. Now, when it comes to the CGI, as mentioned before, and as Dave said, sometimes it can just look terrible. And I think that without a doubt is what dates this movie. However, the makeup effects done on Marcus and a lot of the other vampires, the blood, again, the costume design, some of the werewolf effects and all that jazz, I think all of that is really solid, which lends itself to really badass action. And without a doubt, it kind of feels like this movie was all about the action. It felt like the story was just this hollow kind of means to an end in a lot of ways, where as you're watching the movie unfold, it's really about, getting to these big action set pieces, where it felt like the movie would stop and give you this beautiful, well put together action sequence that has a lot of really great things that are going on, except the story wasn't all that fulfilling, to be completely and utterly honest. Overall though, I do find this to still be an enjoyable watch. I definitely don't think it's anywhere near that super low Rotten Tomato critic score. I think it's definitely an enjoyable film if you're into action, if you're into lore heavy, just big, over-the-top fantasy movies. There's definitely enjoyment to be had, but in terms of a really strong narrative, I do agree it is messy, and I don't think I can necessarily praise the story element of it, though I do enjoy the lore. Now, Dave mentioned that he wanted to talk about one thing in particular that happened to Kate Beckinsale's character, and I guess I should have told him that we would be doing spoilers. So for the future, spoilers. But for right now, yeah, what happens in this movie is that Kate Beckinsale's character ends up taking blood from Alexander Corvinus, or Corvinus, I believe is how you say his name. And he is the father of Marcus and William, the first Lycan and the first vampire. And he himself is an immortal. And so he ends up giving his blood over to Selene, making her a bit of a hybrid of, this immortal being who started this all, as well as the vampire that she already was. And so that makes her a lot stronger, a lot more impervious to damage in the later part of the film, and ultimately sets up for an interesting story moving forward. In a lot of ways, this movie tells a fun, cohesive narrative that you can follow and, has a beginning, middle, and end, but it is a bit messy. So that's going to be my general thoughts on the film. I've already talked about Kate Beckinsale, I've talked about Scott Speedman, but if I had to touch on a couple other actors really quickly, it'd be Tony Curran, who plays Marcus in this film. I thought he was fantastic in the role. I know him mainly for me, actually, from the Doctor Who new Van Gogh episode. I thought he was great in that episode. I believe that's the same actor. And then Derek Jacobi, who I thought was pretty solid in this film as well. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of characters and moments that are all that strong, and I think that that's what holds this movie back from really being a really solid follow-up to what is a really solid first film. So that's going to be my thoughts. That's going to be Dave's thoughts. A big thanks to you guys for watching. Please go down below in the description box and give my guests some love. Dave from Interpreting the Stars, he's got tons of great movie related content over there, and I highly recommend go give him some love. And for now, I will leave you guys. So a big thanks to you guys for watching. Hit that like button, comment your thoughts, subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.